Hello there, friends. Today I've come out to Riverfront Park once again, and there's been a lull in the rain, so I figured it's time to share another article on this lovely day. And today we'll be providing some tips and advice on how to deal with a passive-aggressive colleague. This is taken from HBR's series on dealing with difficult people. Here is the book. And the author of today's article is Amy Gallo. I'll share a little bit about the author first, and then we'll jump into what Amy has to say about dealing with passive-aggressive colleagues. Amy Gallo is a contributing editor at Harvard Business Review and the author of the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, which was published in 2017. She writes and speaks about workplace dynamics. See her website amyegallo.com and follow her on Twitter, now X, at amyegallo. Great. So let's see what Amy has to say about dealing with passive-aggressive colleagues, easily one of the most uncomfortable situations that we can find ourselves in the workplace. Your colleague says one thing in a meeting, but then does another. He passes you in the hallway without saying hello and talks over you in meetings. But when you ask to speak with him about his behavior, he insists that everything's fine and the problem is all in your head. But it's not. He's being passive-aggressive. Now, working with someone like this can be so frustrating. Do you address the behavior directly? Do you try to ignore it? How can you get to the core issue when your colleague pretends that nothing is going on? What the experts say. It's not uncommon for colleagues to occasionally make passive-aggressive remarks to one another over particularly sensitive issues, or when they feel they can't be direct. We're all guilty of doing it once in a while, says Amy Sue, co-author of Own the Room, Discover Your Signature Voice to Master Your Leadership Presence. But persistent passive-aggressive behavior is a different ballgame altogether. These are people who will often do anything to get what they need, including lie, says Annie McKee, founder of the Teleos Leadership Institute and co-author of Primal Leadership, Unleashing the Power of Emotional Intelligence. In these cases, you have to take special precautions that help you and hopefully your counterpart both get your jobs done. Here are some tips. I will, as always, share the titles for all the tips and then jump into them one by one. There are quite a few here, so I'll be running on for a second. Number 1, don't get caught up. Number 2, consider what's motivating the behavior. Number 3, own your part. Number 4, focus on the content and not on the delivery. Number 5, acknowledge the underlying issue. Number 6, watch your language. Number 7, find safety in numbers. Number 8, set guidelines for everyone. Number 9, get help in extreme situations. Number 10, protect yourself. So those are the 10 tips, and let's dash through them. Number 1, don't get caught up. When your coworker pretends nothing is going on or accuses you of overreacting, it's hard not to get angry and defensive. But this is not one of those situations to fight fire with fire, McKee says. Do your best to remain calm. The person may want you to get mad so that they can blame you afterwards, which is a release of their own anxiety, Sue explains. Responding in an emotional way will likely leave you looking and feeling like a fool. This is your opportunity to be the bigger person. So tip number 1 is don't get caught up. Number 2, consider what is motivating this behavior. People who routinely act in a passive-aggressive way aren't necessarily complete jerks. It could be that they don't know how to communicate or are afraid of conflict. McKee says that passive-aggressive behavior is often a way for people to get their emotional point across without having a true, healthy conflict. There's also a self-centeredness to it. They make the flawed assumption that others should know what they are feeling and that their needs and preferences are more important than those of others, says Sue. Understand this, but don't try to diagnose all your colleagues' problems. You just have to see it for what it is, Sue adds. An unproductive expression of emotions that they can't share constructively. There is a skill to having a true, healthy conflict, and that takes a lot of practice and communication. And if you start off in a situation where you're very uncomfortable with this sort of situation, you simply don't learn those skills over time. Advice number 3 is own your part. Chances are that you're not blameless in the situation. Ask yourself, is there something that you're doing that is contributing to the dynamic or causing the person to be passive-aggressive? Own your half, says Sue. Also, consider whether you've dished out the same behavior and know the signs. Now, in this, Amy references another article about how to know the signs. I'll share that reference here, so that way if you want to sort of analyze your own behavior, which is a very important part of developing your management and leadership skills, you can reference this. And the article, which references, by the way, knowing the signs of your own behavior, is Signs You're Being Passive-Aggressive, written by Muriel Manyan Wilkins on the HBR website. Anyway, continuing. Know the signs. It can happen to even the best of us, whether we're procrastinating or wanting to avoid something. We might leak emotions in a way that's hurtful to other people. So recognize your own behavior and own your half. That will do a great deal to furthering resolution of these passive-aggressive issues. Tip number 4, focus on the content and not on the delivery. It might be the last thing you want to do, but try to see the situation from your colleague's perspective. What is the underlying opinion or perspective that they're trying to convey with their snarky comment? Analyze the position the person is trying to share with you, says McKee. Does that person think that the way you're running the project isn't working? Or does that person disagree about your team's goals? Not everyone knows how to publicly discuss or express what they think, says Sue. If you can focus on the underlying business concern or question rather than the way it's being delivered, you can move on to addressing the actual problem. Number 5, acknowledge the underlying issue. Once you're calm and able to engage in a productive conversation, go back to the person. Say something like, "You made a good point in that exchange we had the other day. Here's what I heard you saying." This will help them talk about the substance of their concerns. By joining with them, you'll have a better chance of turning the energy around, McKee explains. And do this in a matter-of-fact way, without discussing how the sentiment was expressed. Don't listen or give any credence to the toxic part, advises Sue. Sometimes it's that they just want their opinion heard. And so you have to hear the opinion. The next tip, watch your language. whatever you say, don't accuse the person of being passive aggressive. That can hurt your own cause, says McKee. And Sue agrees. It's such a loaded word now. It would put someone who's already on the defensive into a more angry position. So don't label or judge them. Instead, McKee advises recounting how some of your previous interactions have played out and explaining the impact it's having on you and possibly on others as well. If feasible, show that the behavior is working against something your counterpart cares about, like achieving the team's goals. The next piece of advice is find safety in numbers. You don't have to deal with this situation alone. It's okay to reality check with others and have allies in place to say you are not crazy, says Sue. But be sure to frame your discussions as an attempt to constructively improve the relationship so it doesn't come off as gossiping and bad-mouthing your colleague, right? That is, gossiping and bad-mouthing your own colleagues is a extremely toxic behavior. It's just as bad as the passive-aggressive behavior. So make sure that you are constructive in how you go about doing this and approaching your own colleagues. Sue suggests you ask for honest opinions. Something like, I was wondering how Emily's comment landed with you. How did you interpret that? The next piece of advice is set guidelines for everyone. You might also enlist the help of others in coming up with a long-term solution. As a team, you can build healthy norms, McKee says. Together, you can agree to be more upfront about frustrations and model the honest and direct interactions you want to happen. You can also keep one another accountable. If your problematic colleague tends to ignore agreements, and sometimes they do this, you might take notes in meetings about who's supposed to do what and when, so that there are clear action items. The worst offenders are likely to give in to the positive peer pressure and public accountability. So develop that good relationship and team of allies so that it'll benefit the whole company, the whole team together. The next advice is get help in extreme situations. When a colleague persistently tries to undermine you or prevent you from doing your job, and outside observers confirm your take on the situation, you might have to go further. If you share the same manager, you may be able to ask for help, says McKee. You might tell your boss, a lot of us have noticed a particular behavior, and I want to talk about how it's impacting my ability to do my work. But step into those waters carefully, she warns. Your manager might be hoodwinked by the person and may not see the same behaviors or be conflict averse themselves and may not want to see it or address it. The next piece of advice, protect yourself. If there's an interdependence in your work, make sure you're meeting your commitments and deadlines, Sue says. Copy others on important emails. Don't let that person speak for you or represent you in meetings. After a meeting, document agreements and next steps. McKee also suggests keeping records. Track specific behaviors so that you have examples if needed, she says. It's hard to argue with the facts. Also, tracking behavior and tracking the timeline of things going on also gives you some time to reflect on what is happening. It gives you some chance to think about it once more and come to terms and better plan for when things happen in the future. She also recommends you try to avoid working with the person and keep contact to a minimum. If you have to work together, do it in a group setting where your colleague is likely to be on better behavior. You might not be able to break the person of their passive aggressive habits, but you can control your reaction to it. Even though the rain has stopped, it's still a bit windy. Almost blew my tripod over. I mean, arguably I do have a cheap tripod. Anyway, that was protecting yourself. Now, from those 10 pieces of advice, Amy shares a few do's and don'ts to help you. Some very simple principles for you to remember. Number 1, do understand why people typically act this way. Their needs probably aren't being met. Number 2, do focus on the message your colleague is trying to convey, even if their delivery is misguided. And number 3, do take a step back and ask yourself if you are contributing to the issue in some way. Own your part. That goes back to that. Number 1, don't lose your cool. Address the underlying business issue in a calm and matter-of-fact way. Number 2, don't accuse the person of acting passive-aggressively. That will only make them more mad and more aggressive. And number 3, don't assume that you can change your colleague's behavior. Now, Amy goes into a couple of case studies. There are 2 case studies, and then the article will wrap up. So, case study number 1, make your coworker publicly accountable. One of Mitch Davis' co-workers in the student guidance office of the public high school where he worked was making things difficult for him. Names and details in both of these case studies have been changed, of course. She would agree to a plan in a meeting, but then sabotage it by not following through, he explains. His colleague, Sarah, defended herself by saying things like, "Oh, that's not how I remember it," or "I didn't think we had finalized the plan." He tried to talk about these misunderstandings with her, but she always shrugged him off. She'd say she was busy or didn't have the time to talk, he explained. So when Mitch told Jim, his and Sarah's boss, that a certain project hadn't gotten done because of this strange dynamic, Jim said that he had noticed the pattern too. Together, they devised a plan to make Sarah more accountable. He and I agreed that he would publicly ask for a volunteer to take notes on each meeting, documenting who would be responsible for accomplishing each task and by when. Mitch recalls that he was the first volunteer. Fantastic. And the approach worked. After Mitch sent round the task list, Sarah could not make excuses anymore. She was accountable to everyone who attended the meetings. And Mitch didn't mind the additional work. The extra effort he put in was less time than the time he was spending fuming about his coworker and running around to pick up the pieces, the things that were not completed. It actually helped everyone in our department be more productive and was something we should have done a long time ago. So that was case study number 1. Case study number 2, when your manager is perhaps not as helpful as you'd like them to be. Get help sooner rather than later. Emily Sullivan, a digital marketing consultant at a small agency, had recently been promoted and managed an 8-person team. One of her direct reports, Will, had only been at the agency for 3 months before Emily's promotion, and he clearly wasn't thrilled to suddenly have her as his new boss. But he was a top performer and extremely competent, Emily recalls. And since they'd worked fairly harmoniously together as colleagues, she was happy to have him in the group. Unfortunately, Will became very difficult to manage. He didn't communicate with Emily unless absolutely necessary. He didn't actively engage in training sessions that she offered, and he poked holes in her initiative. He took every opportunity to make it clear that he did not value her input, she explains. Surprised and dismayed by his attitude, Emily decided to address it as she would any other team member, directly and clearly. She started by asking him in one of their one-to-one meetings whether something was wrong. He said there wasn't, but the behavior persisted. So she tried taking him out for coffee and asking whether she had unknowingly offended him or if he wanted to be managed in a different way. He acknowledged that there was a personality clash, she said, but he ended the conversation there and continued to treat her dismissively at the office. She heard from other staff members that he had even called her lazy and useless around the office. The last thing I wanted was to pass the issue further up the chain and potentially harm Will's career, she says. After all, he was a valuable team member and she wanted to protect him. But she came to see that she should have gone to her manager from the very beginning. When she eventually did, her boss pointed out that her failure to effectively manage a key team member amounted to poor performance on her part. Within a year, both Emily and Will voluntarily left the agency, but neither was happy with the circumstances. She says that if she could do it over again, she would have talked to her manager right away, kept better records of Will's toxic attitude, and when there weren't drastic improvements, fired him without hesitation. Well, that marks the end of today's article on how to deal with a passive-aggressive colleague. There were a great number of tips in there, and hopefully they are useful to you. Of course, this is something that you're going to have to practice over time and develop your skills, because it is a very uncomfortable situation. So good luck. Thank you.